Hey guys, what's going on? Andrew coming at you, and in this one, we're going to talk about Sweden joining NATO, what that means for Sweden, and what that means for NATO. And first, I can tell you from living here, I've never seen an issue so divided where it felt like 50% of the people wanted to stay neutral and 50% of the people were interested in joining NATO. And then it started to feel like it was shifting little by little. I would say before the war in Ukraine, probably 70% of the population wanted to stay neutral. But once the war happened, things started to change, especially when people saw how weak Russia was. And because they have a smaller population, they put a lot of their money into building up great artillery, having a very advanced navy, and especially the Air Force. I'm not sure so many people are aware of this, but during the peak of the Cold War, Sweden had the fifth largest Air Force in the world. And on a side note, Sweden is one of the biggest arms dealers across the world for a smaller country. Their fighter jet, the Gripen, or the Griffin in English, is very popular. It's just like a multi-purpose jet. It can be, what's really remarkable about this jet is it can take off from like a very short runway. If you're a smaller military, you can be able to use this plane to do many purposes. You can do reconnaissance, air-to-air combat, air-to-ground combat. What already Sweden was spending on its defense budget and all the other things in the country as far as like the democracy goes means that there wasn't going to be a lot of steps needed to get them into NATO, not to mention that Sweden was always exercising with NATO because this could always be a possibility. I can say that after the war, I think most people in Sweden came to the realization of this. If you are a country and you want to protect yourself, you have two options. You can join NATO or you can develop nuclear weapons. But without having those two deterrents, you always have to accept the fact that there's a possibility that you could be in conflict and be taken over. I think Sweden, like Finland, will be a huge asset to NATO because Finland, for example, has actually fought Russia and won and maintained they had to give up some territory during World War II, but they were very, very successful. And there's a lot of parallels between the war in Ukraine and the war between Finland and Russia during World War II. But I think what Sweden is mostly going to bring is it is going to open up the ability for a lot more Swedish weapons to be used by other NATO countries. I suspect you're going to see a lot more fighter jets purchased in the future because I think it just makes sense for some countries to have one fighter jet as opposed to maybe an F-35 and an F-16 or other fighter jets that would have different capabilities. It's nice to have an all-around jet, and the cost between the F-35 and a Gripen is that a Gripen is cheaper to operate. That's always been the case. I think it's cheaper to fly per hour than an F-35. I think Sweden joining NATO only makes us stronger in Europe. I think it makes us stronger in the West. I just wish that it didn't have to happen because of a war in Ukraine. Because personally, I support Ukraine, and I think they have every right to defend themselves. But as an American that has looked at the Iraq War draw out and drag out like it did, I just hope that that isn't the case with this conflict. I hope that there can be an end to this soon. I don't think that Sweden will want to have any nuclear weapons stored on its land. I think that's going to be a big no-no. I think probably the same with Finland, because I think in Finland it's illegal right now to have any nuclear weapons. I know that Sweden, for those of you that didn't know, Sweden had a nuclear arms program, and they came very close to developing a nuclear weapon, but decided to stop their nuclear weapons program, and they also were dealing with the U.S. at the time. They came to the conclusion on their own, but I'm just saying the United States was also working with them to see if they would possibly not keep arming, because there were a lot of countries that were developing nuclear weapons, like South Africa, for example, where they decided to disable all their nuclear weapons. I think that this is a win. The only issue always when you're in NATO, and I'm just saying this as is the more countries that get into NATO, and certain countries in NATO, I'm not going to mention them here now, but there's always the potential that a NATO partner could do something that could drag us into a war that maybe we don't agree with, or there might be some countries that Sweden has to deal with. For example, for Sweden getting into NATO, they had to jump through a lot of hoops from Turkey. And in some cases, people that were Kurdish in Sweden were either turned over to Turkey, or they had to make steps for some Kurds that were considered a terrorist organization. But from my opinion, looking at it, I'm like, are these people terrorists, or is this just somebody Erdogan, the president of Turkey or the dictator of Turkey, just doesn't like, and it's something we had to deal with in order to get into NATO? So there's always going to be some controversy around it. But I think as long as we look into history moving forward for the security of Europe, the security of Sweden and Finland, it makes sense for the countries to join. So this is just my opinion. I'd be very interested to hear what you all think. So please let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Hej då!